Okay, good morning everyone. My name's Andy Schooler, Chairman of the Harwich Society, and just before I say a few words about Randolph Julian Stow, I just wanted to, by way of explanation, tell you why we're doing it in this way. The plaque was commissioned by the Harwich Society more than 18 months ago, and the tenants of it would be very pleased to have that up on their wall, and the owner of the house also says he's very pleased to have it, but he has asked us not to do anything with it until he's redecorated the front of his house, and you can see that it's in sore need of redecoration. Randolph Julian Stow was born in 1935 in the Western Australian town of Geraldton. It's about 260 miles north of Perth, a 4.5-hour car journey, so in Australian terms, just up the road. His father was the town's only solicitor, and his mother came from long-established pioneering stock. He had an idyllic rural childhood. He attended the prestigious Guildford Grammar School in Perth as a boarder, and one of his erstwhile schoolmates is actually here today. As a young man in his early 20s, he became known as a somewhat precocious novelist and poet who had written 3 books while still an undergraduate student. His original intention was to follow his father into the law, but his love of literature put paid to that, and he would go on to win Australia's most revered literary prize, the Miles Franklin Award, for his novel To the Islands. His first 2 novels and poetry collection were published in England in 1956 and 1957, but soon after he disappeared into a remote Aboriginal mission in Northern Australia, where he picked up the local Indigenous language, and this formed the background to his award-winning novel To the Islands. He went on to become a cadet patrol officer and was seconded to the government anthropologist, travelling with him to the very isolated Trobriand Islands in the Solomon Sea off the coast of New Guinea. Repatriated to Australia due to ill health, he experienced a severe writing block and departed for England. Eventually, getting back on an even keel, in 1979, he published his cathartic novel Visitants, which was set in the Trobriands, and also its sequel, The Green Girl as Elderflower, which had an East Anglian background. Further travels followed to Scotland, Malta, North America, Alaska and France. Whilst living in Malta, he stayed with an artist friend, Patrick Maxwell, known as Rashid. His daughter is also here with us today. Randolph Stow then settled permanently in England, first in East Bergholt and later in 1981 in Harwich. In 1984, he published The Suburbs of Hell, a surreal murder mystery in which a number of local Harwich characters were recognisable, and in some cases, much too recognisable. Stow felt comfortable in the land of his ancestors, and particularly in Old Harwich, a seaport just like Geraldton. At his house in King's Head Street, he installed a small circular window in his writing room, and it can still be seen just up there, designed in the form of a porthole, and this allowed him to watch the ships as they passed at the end of his street whilst he was writing. He was a person who liked to be left in peace. He was always known as Mick, or occasionally Mike. In his later years, he told a journalist, "I'm in a funny position of not having a pseudonym for writing, but I've got a pseudonym for living. I'm just this fella who's called Mick or Mike, whom people often take as a seaman or perhaps a truck driver." The story goes that on one occasion a literary journalist turned up uninvited, and not finding Mick here at home, he went looking for him at the nearby pub. The publican glanced over to where Stow sat in his customary corner with a book and a pint, and when Mick kept his head down, the landlord told the journalist that he hadn't seen him for days. His later years were spent reading and writing reviews for the Times Literary Supplement and visiting his favourite pubs, where he might be found reading a Scandinavian crime novel and doing his Times crossword. He was known to some as Mick the Book, not because he was a writer, but because he could answer almost any question thrown up in any pub trivia quiz. And few of those present knew that his novels were taught in Australian schools and studied at universities. After 30 years in Harwich, Randolph Stow died in 2010, aged 74. He was buried at Oakfield Wood Burial Ground near Rabness, in a grave marked only by a young hazel tree and a wooden plaque, a place that he chose himself and where he felt at peace. He was a very private man, and there were people in Harwich who spent time in the pub with him and knew him socially, but were completely unaware of his Australian fame until after his death. On behalf of the Harwich Society, we are proud to unveil this plaque to the memory of Randolph Julian Stow, a celebrated citizen of Australia who made his home here in Harwich, in this house in King's Head Street. And I'm going to ask Sue now to give her reminiscences of Randolph Julian Stow, or Mick, as he was very much known in Harwich.
Thank you. I first encountered Mick when I moved to Old Harwich in 1984. I would often see him walking down the street to Harwich from Dovercourt, carrying what appeared to be a fairly heavy bag over his shoulder. I would offer him a lift if it was raining, but he always refused. I don't know why, but he did. We were on nodding terms in the street. I didn't know who he was, but I never took him to be a truck driver or a seafarer. He was too serious and he was too clean. In the early 90s, a friend in Perth, Western Australia, sent me a newspaper cutting about a famous writer who lived in Harwich, and I recognised Mick immediately. The journalist had a tough time getting Mick to say anything worth reporting, and the article mostly outlined his incredible literary achievements. Two quotes stuck in my mind though. When asked why he hadn't written anything recently, Mick said, "I have nothing else to say." And when he was asked what made him happy, he simply said, "Beer." I did a bit of research. My Australian friends gave me a pile of novels to read. My cousins in Melbourne had not only heard of him, but had studied his work at school, as he was required reading on the national curriculum. I'm talking about the 60s and 70s. I became a fan. 3 years ago, I gave a guided tour to a gentleman who had attended the same school as Mick, Guildford Grammar School in Perth. He kindly donated a portrait of Mick to the Harwich Society and a copy of his biography written by the Sydney author Suzanne Falconer. It was only then that I discovered Mick's heavy shoulder bag, which I had fondly imagined was full of books and possibly his most recent novel, was actually full of his washing. I came to realise that Mick was a person of considerable significance, not only in literary circles, but also in the history of Harwich. He had moved here and spent the last 30 years of his life here. He'd written his last book here, and he felt comfortable here. And I thought we should honour him and his presence in our history with a plaque. Mick's books are no longer on the Australian school curriculum, but he has pockets of hardcore followers all over the world. Nadine Gassi, a French enthusiast, is currently translating his major novels, which are selling well in France. As a tour guide, I meet people, and I'm always surprised when I ask them if they've heard of Mick Stow. They say, "Oh yes, you know, we did them at school." Or last week, a couple of weeks ago, I met a lady from Brisbane, and she said, "Yes, I'm reading him at the moment." And I said, "Did you know that he used to live up the road?" And she was absolutely stunned. We were in the Christopher Jones house. She was stunned when I told her that he lived here. He is not forgotten. I shall now hand over to the gentleman who attended the same school as Mick, Jerry Rendell, who will read the poem Landfall.
Thank you very much, Sue. When I was at school at Guildford with Mick, I lived on Christmas Island in the Indian Ocean. My father was in fact the pilot on the island. It's about 1,500 miles from Fremantle, the port of Perth, of course, a couple of hundred miles south of Indonesia, if you like. In those days, the only way of getting there was by cargo ship. The cargo ship's called maybe once a month, something like that. And the journey from Fremantle to Christmas Island was a week. And that meant that the only time I could get home to Christmas Island was in the long summer holiday, which of course, was the Christmas holiday. When we arrived at the island, on the day of our arrival, I was usually invited to go up on the bridge, and I used to go up there first thing in the morning, and I would watch for hours for the speck on the horizon which would become the island. So I will now read Landfall. And indeed I shall anchor one day, some summer morning of sunflowers and bougainvillea and arid wind, and smoking a black cigar, one hand on the mast, turn and unlaid my eyes of all their cargo. And the parrot will speed from my shoulder, and white yachts glide welcoming out from the shore on the turquoise tide. And when they ask me where I have been, I shall say I do not remember. And when they ask me what I have seen, I shall say I remember nothing. And if they should ever ask me to speak again, I shall smile and refrain. So you can see in there that the white yacht gliding out from the shore to welcome the ship on the turquoise tide was my father's pilot boat.
Thank you very much. On behalf of the Harwich Society then, we are really, really proud to unveil this plaque.